The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, so now we have around 119 people joined in. Let's begin. Greetings and good afternoon, everyone. I am Komal Khatri from World Resource Institute, India. WRI India is an Indian research to action organization. We work to accelerate India's development. On behalf of WRI India and Circular Apparel Innovation Factory, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the webinar, Impact of COVID-19 on Sustainable Fashion in India. Just a few instructions before we begin. All attendees will remain in listen-only mode. However, please use the questions pane on the panel to your right to post questions during the webinar. Please keep typing in your questions or comments. We'll take them during the Q&A sessions. Also, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all participants. There will be some poll questions from time to time, and it'll be great if you could all engage and answer those questions. It'll be fun to see the poll answers. So today we have esteemed panel of speakers who will provide us guidance and discuss the new challenges thrown up by the COVID-19. We will start by WRI India on social and environmental guidance on which WRI and WRAP are working for past couple of years. Followed up by presentation by CAIF. After that, we'll have panel discussions, which will be followed up by question and answer session, and then we'll conclude the webinar. Now, I would like to invite Priyal Shah from WRI India to present on Guidebook to Measure Social and Environmental Impact of Clothing Reuse Business Models. Over to you, Priyal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Priyal. I'm a consultant at WRI India, and I'm part of the climate program here. The Square Circle Guidebook has been jointly developed by WRI and WRAP as part of the Clothing Reuse Market Makers project. We would like to thank the Laudes Foundation for their support and all the brands and apparel manufacturers who have been a part of the working group. Before we delve a little deeper into the guidebook, I would like to talk a little bit about the textile and apparel industry in India. It's an important sector for us with its economic importance. The textile and apparel industry was estimated at $100 billion in 2018-19 and is the second largest employment provider for agriculture and employs about 45 million people. The sector contributes 2.3% to India's GDP and accounts for 15% of country's export earnings. Apart from being a manufacturing hub, India is on track to become the sixth largest apparel market in the world by 2022. On the one hand, it offers employment and has economic importance. However, on the other, there are externalities associated with it, such as consumption of resources, waste generation, and pollution, which need to be addressed, and a shift to circular business models can help do that. There are several different levers which can help the transition to circular economy, and reuse of clothing is one of the most direct levers to capture value and design out waste and pollution in the apparel system. Clothing is currently being massively underutilized. More than $460 billion of value is being lost globally each year because consumers are throwing away clothes they could continue to wear. The Clothing Reuse Market Makers project is aimed at capturing this lost value by increasing clothing utilization through the adoption of reuse business models such as rental, leasing, repair, subscription, and re-commerce. For this project, we engaged with leading apparel brands and manufacturers in the US, UK, and India through working groups to address some of the critical external elements that were missing. We did this through three of our work streams. The first work stream, we looked at evidence of consumer demand, where we surveyed consumers to understand their appetite towards reuse business models. The second work stream was to have common definitions and metrics to measure social and environmental impact, as there was no framework available to guide brands on what data and assumptions could be used to estimate the social and environmental impact. The Square Circle Guidebook, which is something I will be taking you through in some time, is a first of its kind guidance. And the last work stream is enabling policies, where we created a policy inventory which maps the policies that either act as barriers or enablers to the adoption of reuse business models. And the objective was to level the playing field for circular models by identifying policies that could enable this transition and accelerate it. I would now like to take you through our guidebook, which has been divided into two parts. One is the environmental section, and the second is the social section. Clothing reuse business models are often assumed to have positive environmental benefits by increasing utilization of clothes. However, companies must be careful of the potential negative impacts it could create, such as increased energy use, water pollution, or material consumption when estimating and communicating the benefits of reuse to their consumers and stakeholders. This environmental section of the guidance would help companies think through necessary data and assumptions required to understand the potential impact of reuse, which would ultimately help them decouple growth from resource consumption. So we begin by, in order to start, we begin by determining the roles through three broad categories stakeholders would have to categorize from. The first are the traditionals in transition. These are brands whose foundation is in the linear production, and success is defined by increased annual profits by increased annual production. And these are companies that are currently exploring integration of reuse business models as a new business line. For example, VF Corporation. Next are the clothing reuse natives. They are mainly marketers and not manufacturers who make profits off of products of the traditionals without the burden of production and motivate traditional organizations to transition and bring reuse in-house. For example, a e-commerce platform such as Kiabza. The third category is service innovators. These are mainly enablers of reuse business models. They are more set to support the transition for traditional organizations over reuse natives, which would ideally have these built-in capacities. Next is to determine the goals by introducing the idea of setting the ambition of decoupling growth from resource use and defining ambitious goals with 5 criteria on a scale of 0 to 5. First is to understand how the organization has quantified the target. Next is to understand how used clothing is being incorporated in their current business operations and the importance of the reuse business model as part of their larger business operations. Also, the clarity and strength in words in the target. And lastly, the originality of the target, whether it's a common, uncommon, or a trailblazing targets. Next, we move on. Next, we move on to how to measure the environmental impact. Here we have two options to consider. One is by understanding the growth rates. Here, the break-even point is the concept that we use, which is when your reuse model takes over traditional model. For example, the speed at which your e-commerce model is growing as compared to your traditional linear sales. Here, the key metrics data to consider are total sales, sales of new garments, sales of reused garments, and total material used. The other option we have here is considering utilization rates based on how many additional wears you're able to create for a reused garment. For example, a rental model can source used data, and the metrics would depend on the company's accessibility and reliability on use and utilization data. Through our engagement with our stakeholders, we also were able to identify two main challenges in this transition to reuse business models. The first is on understanding and shaping consumer behavior to maximize positive impact of reuse business models. And the other is tracking and disclosing of volume produced at industry levels, which would help us to understand how the overall impact of this transition. So this is how we estimate the environmental impact. While most of the circular economy focus lies on the environmental aspect, there is an urgent need to include social aspects in any circular economy framework. And I will be taking you through the second section to understand how we can prioritize a just and inclusive transition. Creating positive social impact through clothing reuse business models would mean prioritizing inclusivity, transparency, and equity, which has largely been a challenge for the traditional clothing models to address. The social guidance asks 3 main questions. First is to see who is a part of your circle by identifying and listing who the stakeholders across the supply chain who would be directly or indirectly affected, and stakeholders who would feel positive or negative impact of this transition. Next is to understand the impacts on the people in your circle by gathering information about the opportunities and how they can be maximized for the stakeholders. And you must also look for potential changes in the relationships between buyers and suppliers. It would also be important to be aware of the impacts on the types of jobs available, gender equity, and living wages. And the third and the last is to see whether all stakeholders are benefiting equitably. And this could be done by, hello, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are.
Unmuted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last is to, the third is to see whether all stakeholders are being benefited equitably by reviewing data and determining where the company has responsibilities and the abilities to influence change, and also to develop metrics and targets for positive impact, which could be done through also engaging with stakeholders and allies to ensure the reuse business transition is a just one. So this is about the social impact estimation, and we would encourage all the stakeholders here to access this guidebook in more detail after its release this year. The guidebook will take you through all of these, through both of these sections in much more detail, and we would love to hear from you once you're able to do that. As we recover from the effects of the current pandemic and also work towards achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we need to realize that the social and economic goals on one hand, and we have the planet and resources related goals on the other. And SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production, is the linchpin which would be balancing both the sides. And I would like to conclude my presentation and invite Siddharth from the CAIF team to take this forward. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Priyal. Thank you for that insightful conversation. It was really good to hear about the framework that WR has built, and I'm sure that it's going to play a very big role in moving the industry forward. Can you hear me, Priyal?
Yes, Siddharth,
Yes,
we can hear you.
Great, thank you. So essentially, CAIF is very glad to partner with WR for this initiative. And CAIF, the Circular Apparel Innovation Factory, is essentially an industry-led initiative to build the capabilities and the ecosystem to drive, towards the transition required for a circular textile and apparel industry in India. We are an initiative which has been, backed by the Doon Foundation. We have Aditya Birla Fashion and Retail as our anchor partners, and it is run by IntelliCap. The main objective, of the Circular Apparel Innovation Factory is to increase the use of sustainable inputs and materials, maximize the utilization of textile and clothing, increasing the recycle of clothing, working towards building those practices in India, boosting production through renewable inputs, as well as minimizing negative social impacts and increasing social responsibility. So how we do this really is through 4 key pillars. Essentially, one is the innovation engine, where we source a lot of different innovations from across the industry, which could be through our network, through partners, as well as also with one-to-one interactions with a lot of different stakeholders from the industry. We also do a lot of on-ground facilitation, which basically means initial level prototypes with certain enterprises as well as brands, wherein we connect a lot of different brands to large enterprises or stakeholders to understand what are the need gaps for traceability, and running small prototypes in different areas. So it could be, let's say, packaging, it could be traceability for blockchain, it could be looking at different sorts of recycled material that could be used. The idea really is to bring on-ground action, and which is one of the key strengths that we bring in. Then we also do market building initiatives, wherein our key objective really is to showcase a network of young enterprises to potential investors or to larger accelerators globally, and provide some of these enterprises with access through either network or strategic partnerships. And then we also play the role of an industry convener, which basically means that we do workshops, which could be at a company level or it could be at an industry level. We also have our CAIF conclave, which is a very large gathering where over 300 to 400 stakeholders from the industry also really recently participated. The idea really being to become that one center point in India where we can connect industry stakeholders, which include brands, enterprises, as well as enablers on one specific platform. Initiatives or some of the key activities that we do in order to drive circularity in apparel and textile is a collaborative working group, which includes members from, which is a pre-competitive environment with different members from the industry. Innovation challenges, we've just concluded one, or in process of concluding one with Aditya Birla, which is towards finding alternatives to single-use plastic. We do supplier innovation days where we present, a network of suppliers or, circular innovators to different brands. We also do on-ground prototyping, convenings, similar to the CAIF conclave that I mentioned, and also innovation workshops, which is the model where we are trying to build awareness by, speaking on specific circularity-related subjects with different stakeholders based on what their sustainability agenda is. Yes, Priya, next slide, please. So the past year, has been very eventful for us at CAIF as an organization. We've engaged with the farm. We've also launched India's first innovation challenge around circularity, which was with Aditya Birla, Fashion and Retail, to find the alternatives to single-use plastic. We've been successful in creating around 16 collaborations with different enterprises and stakeholders. We've sourced a large network of innovations, and we've also done investor showcases last year, in which we were also very fortunate, or we had a pleasure partnering with Fashion for Good for the same at the Sankalp Conclave. As CAIF, what we are really proud of is our industry-led digital platform, which is the first of its kind for circular innovators. Just lay down the agenda for our panel discussion. And over here, I'd like to invite Pavitra Mohanraj, who's the founder and director of Infinitive. Pavitra is a seasoned sustainability professional with a passionate commitment towards systems-level thinking. She has worked in various roles in the sector across Singapore and India, and we're very glad to have her with us. Over to you, Pavitra. Thank you. Yes, Pavitra, over to you.
Pavitra, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you for unmuting me. Okay, I was just saying, before we get into our panel discussion, thank you, Siddharth, for that introduction. And before we get into the panel discussion, can I invite our panelists to turn on the webcams? Consider this the equivalent of inviting you onto the stage before we start a panel. Okay, yay, thank you very much. So thank you to WRI and hi. Are all of you able to unmute yourselves?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you to WRI and CAIF for bringing together such a wonderful set of panelists today to discuss what is turning out to be a very, very important subject. So over the next 40 minutes or so, what we're going to do is engage our panelists in a discussion on what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the apparel and textile sector in India specifically. What are some of the changes in consumption patterns that we are expecting to see with both traditional and reused business models? And also, very, very importantly, how do we build back better after COVID? I don't know when after COVID is, but how do we build back better, as we learn more about this crisis and move on? Just a quick note here that, we're still trying to understand the scale of the crisis. We're working out how long it's going to last, how much we're affected, how quickly will we get back to business. So think of this as sort of a midway pulse check, because we're still understanding so many different things, and businesses are doing contingency planning and so on and so forth. Okay, so before I go any further, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Ekta Jain. Ekta has about 20 years of experience now in the apparel and textile sector, and she currently heads the Spun business, which is a social enterprise initiative by WellSpun for handcrafted textiles. And they work on empowering women and engaging with artisans to build a sustainable future. Ekta's graduated from the London College of Fashion back in 2001, and she's worked with a whole bunch of renowned retailers, including Trent and retailers in the UK. Ekta.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Pavitra, for such a lovely introduction. And good evening, good afternoon to all my co-panel panelists. So thank you very much, and I look forward for this wonderful discussion this afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Ekta.
Thank
To Priyanka now. Priyanka is the intern at Fashion for Good. She leads Fashion for Good's first regional innovation platform in South Asia, which was just launched earlier this year in January. And through the program, Priyanka is engaging the entire Asian textile ecosystem to drive the transition to circularity by engaging with brands, manufacturers, and very importantly, innovators in the region. Do you want to say a quick hi, Priyanka?
Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here.
And finally, on to Nohar, I would like to point out that we have 3 women on this panel, which is great. And this, yeah. And Nohar, thank you for being here with us. Nohar is the founder and CEO of the e-commerce website Kiabsa. I hope many of you here have heard about it. Kiabsa was founded in 2018 for the buying and selling of branded pre-owned fashion. Nohar has over 20 years of business experience, having run the Kishko Group's global business, which was centered around the recycling and upcycling of producer as well as consumer textile waste of all types. Do you want to say hi, Nohar?
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. It's nice being here. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and I usually tend to forget to do this, but I'm Pavitra, and I run Infinitive. We're a young startup working on enabling the primarily in the areas of communications, capacity building, and research. So at the end of the panel discussion, we will have time. We've not forgotten our audience. We'll have about 10 to 12 minutes to take questions from what is a very large number of people here in the audience today. So as we are talking with the panelists, please feel free to put your questions into the question box or the chat box, and we'll try to address them later on in the conversation. Okay, so beginning now. Okay, so we've seen the pandemic, and the resulting sort of social and economic fallout has left the apparel and textile industries facing unprecedented challenges globally, but also specifically in India, given that textiles is the second largest employment provider in the country. And while we've seen different consumer goods sectors affected, the discretionary nature of apparel makes it a sector that's been even more affected than some of the others, right? And it's not one particular aspect of the value chain. Pretty much everyone's affected, from the brands and the manufacturers to the retailers and the workers. Just going to quote a quick number here. The Apparel Export Promotion Council has come out and said that about 65% of the payment of apparel exporters, which amounts to close to $2 billion, remains stuck with foreign buyers. Right now, that's a massive amount. And this it's a very interesting juncture for the industry in general. Even before the pandemic hit, globally, the apparel industry was on tenterhooks for 2020. But on the other side, there was also this massive commitment to move towards sustainability and circularity. Brand after brand was publicly declaring their commitment, right? And we started having a very robust ecosystem evolve, a startup ecosystem evolve as well. But the pandemic has changed things, right? And if you've read some of the reports out there, fashion and luxury executives have said that they're expecting the impact to last anywhere between 12 to 18 months. So what really does this mean? And in India here, we have very unique challenges. For instance, the migrant worker crisis, right? So how do we deal with all of these things? Within the context of this, I'm going to bring Ekta in to take our first question here, which is, can you delve a little deeper into what the impact of the COVID crisis has been on the industry? And can you share your perspectives both from the WellSpun India company perspective as well as the Spun initiative, which works with the artisans and women? Over to you, Ekta.
Thank you, Pavitra. So as we, you very rightly said, textile industry is, huge industry, and a lot of people have got affected. And it's not just one area of the industry. It's everyone, starting from consumers to the buyers, the manufacturers, the retailers, the supply chain, the laborers. Everyone is affected in a great way. In its own ways, like consumers are, wondering what is going to be the economy, how would they have the same spending powers or not. The supply chains are affected because of the movement and various things like that. Now, it's very important in this time that, for everyone to understand the importance of embracing change. Change is not easy, but when these kind of pandemics or kind of an forceful events happen, I think it is very important to have a positive attitude towards it and embrace change. If I talk from a Wellspun and Spun initiative, we are pretty much, trying to do that to our best capability. Yes, there's a lot to be done, but in terms of, engagement with our employees, in terms of upskilling them, because that's a key thing. How do we embrace change? By upskilling our current employees in different kind of skills so that they can handle those requirements from our customers, or like when we are talking about sustainability, how do we embrace technology in digitization? So upskilling and engagement with the employees in terms of whether the mental the emotional quotient as well is quite important. Do we connect? We were just talking before this panel discussion started that it's so nice to see everyone's faces. So I think that emotional quotient and kind of engaging with employees, are we giving them enough offering on the health programs, nutritional guidelines? That is also quite important. And we at Wellspun and Spun are pretty much, doing that to our best capability. This also has led to a great emphasis on hygiene and safety, like social distancing. So hygiene, whether, we are for the companies to see how they can give that assurance to their workers, laborers, that while they are coming to work, they are safe, whether it be having an alternative working hours, shift systems, or those sanitizing tunnels to be implemented. So safety and hygiene is quite important. And I believe while there will be a great emphasis on hygiene and safety from not just what companies can do to offer to their employees, but also it's a general factor from every aspect. If we see from a retailer side, then also they have to make sure that the environment, the shopping environments are safe. Trial rooms. How are we going to kind of digitize our trial rooms? Is 3D visualization, like, can you see in front of a mirror and instead of trying on a clothes, is that a possibility? So those kind of things. So that's where technology, digitization will become the key drivers, and these kind of things will come into play.
Thank you, Ekta. And I think we are gonna, through the later part of this conversation, delve into some of those aspects in a bit more detail. Priyanka, can we have you share, you've been engaging with brands, manufacturers, and innovators. Can we have you share what you're seeing as the impacts on the brands, as well as the innovators? Because we see the sort of burgeoning startup ecosystem starting to shake a little bit. Is funding going to be available? What do we prioritize? What do we not? So can we have your inputs on that?
Sure. If I start with just an overview of what is happening, I think most people are aware of what is happening with brands dealing with slower demand, a lot of move towards online sales and excess inventory. It's further, the whole system is moving towards then manufacturers dealing with slower orders and excess inventory problems, as well as logistics as worker issues. And then, of course, factories that are now opening up in the last couple of weeks, but opening up at a much lower capacity. So all of this definitely overall impacts innovators. They are significantly affected. And we have done certain surveys with our innovators to actually understand what that area's impact is. So currently what we understand from almost 100 innovations across the world, not just India included, of course, is that there is a big slowdown in the amount of business development that most of the companies were doing, most of the startups were doing. Of course, there is a slowdown in the capital as well. Not so much capital is suddenly available. A lot of existing conversations have also been stalled for later. But just as Ekta mentioned, there is a silver lining, or there is a positive side to it also, particularly with some section of innovators which are becoming more and more relevant now. They will see, they are expecting much better, let's say, long-term support from brands now. So highlighting certain companies working in digital, certain companies working in circular business models. These are all areas that are expecting much more positive impact and accelerated growth in the longer term. So yes, there is, I would say, a bit of a mixed response here. But our understanding, or at least the innovators' understanding, is that this impact is about 12 months worth of impact. In fact, in early stage technologies, which are much more, let's say, at research stage, there seems to be just a big pause button. And it's just paused, and everything should pick up once things open up at the same level. However, with mid and later stage technologies, I think that is where they are facing larger impacts, because innovators, of course, are smaller companies. They have limited cash flows, and they have to ride this entire pandemic time. Yeah.
Right. Very interesting. And I think Fashion for Good has a lot of work to do in keeping tabs on how the, where innovators are going to need that support as, we start coming out of, as we start building the recovery after this, right? And I say after this in a fairly, largest manner, but yeah, so whenever we're going to recover from the pandemic. I want to take a moment here. I think the WRI team has a poll question that we'd like the audience to answer. I hope you can all see the poll and quickly answer that before we move on to the next part of the discussion. All right. Thank you for answering the poll. I think this, okay. The poll results disappeared before I could read them out to you, but I think most of you would have seen that.
I think this was probably one of the questions in polls ever I have seen, which has got 99% answered in one way. So I have never seen a poll question which has got 99% as one.
I guess that tells you the magnitude of
Yes.
Change here. So moving on to the next bit of the discussion, let's zoom in on consumption patterns, right? So even before the pandemic, the industry was going through this, hey, consumer behavior is changing, particularly if you consider segments like Gen Z, right? And the pandemic has brought some of those things into sharper focus, right? What are some of the likely shifts that we're going to see in consumption patterns and, through traditional as well as newer business models like reuse? Maybe we can focus on the traditional business models first. And Nohar, would you like to take this? Give us your perspective on how the traditional business models are shifting.
Yeah, I think you need to first break the traditional business models into the offline and the online. As you said, Generation Z has always been comfortable on online, but the previous generations haven't. They've preferred the offline mode of shopping. Now, that's going to change because obviously at this moment, a lot of malls and things like that are not even available in many parts of the world. But as they become open and as people have the option to go there, I think people are going to take their time to actually get comfortable going over there. So you're going to have less footfalls, you're going to have social distancing measures, you're going to have, some of these things that we Ekta talked of, no trial rooms. A lot of brands have already come out with that we're not going to offer our clothing for trial, and you've got to just buy it and walk away. If you're going to just buy it and walk away, then you might as well shop online. Of course, you can still touch product, but I'm not sure in this situation people want to go and touch product as well. So a lot of things will emerge over a period of time, but what's clear here is that the business is going to move dramatically to the online side, and you're going to have all generations getting more and more comfortable with that. Now, with online, again, you're at least assured of a certain contactless delivery, because now companies like Amazon have stopped cash on delivery in India at the moment, which was a big part of their business because they wanted to be as contactless as possible. So when you go into the online space, then you're really looking at the new clothing which people buy, or then you're looking at reuse, and that's a little bit where we come in. Now, people want to buy less at the moment. That's quite clear, but that's right in the heart of the pandemic and the lockdown and things like that. But as things evolve, we got to really see what their habits are going to be, what their patterns are going to be. But what's emerged to us as a company is that people are realizing that they don't actually need as much clothing as they have. I think most of the world has worn the same 10 t-shirts and shorts sitting at home for the last couple of months, and you just look at your wardrobe and you have so much clothing and you're actually doing nothing with it. So a lot of things are going to change. It'll be very interesting to see how it moves forward.
Right, fair point. Like, we all have clothes sitting around, and I think one of the sort of refrains that's going around is whether some of these changes in consumer behavior or consumption patterns are going to stick or not. And I think sort of the big part of the answer to that is it depends on how long we're in lockdown and how long we're going to stay away from offices, right, before that consumer behavior sticks. Ekta, would you like to come in and talk to us about what you're seeing in terms of buying from spun? Like, what are you seeing from the consumers? Like, do you see shifts in their buying patterns?
So, Pavitra, definitely to build on what Noha said, online is going to be a big driver or big factor of how people buy. But I think, again, like a lot of people are staying home. They are spending more time at home, connecting with themselves. There are so many things, like I mentioned before, nutrition, hygiene, safety. People are connecting. They have more time. Like, a lot of people are saying that, okay, let's meditation practices, and all these are becoming more popular. So while you're trying to connect with yourself, I think that emotional connect with the product as well is something we have seen in spun, where our customers are looking for naturally dyed products, something that they can connect with sustainability aspect, the social impact that the product is going to make on the environment and to the communities. So it's going to become, I believe, we like you said at the beginning, we all are in the all are in the learning phase, and it will tell us what happens in the next coming year. But at least for now, I think what we can see from what our customers are expecting is how are we making an impact both on our communities and the way we are producing our goods is a key factor.
Right. Thank you for that. And that brings me to the other aspect. We said traditional, but also reuse business models. Priyanka, can we have your inputs here? I mean, like, what I understand is brands have been testing reuse business models for over the past few years, but how is this crisis sort of changing their perspective on that? Is it accelerating some kind of behaviors? Like, what's happening in the reuse business model space with the brands?
Sure. So it's actually quite interesting to see both Ekta and Noha mentioning consumer, because earlier last year we'd done a report with Accenture on circular business models, and we were basically tracking the barriers and the potential. And one of the key barriers was actually consumer mindsets. And we were kind of tracking that it's changing slowly, and consumers are actually becoming more and more comfortable with, let's say, rentals, reuse sort of models. So it's very interesting to see now that is the perception is now with this pandemic that consumer behavior only accelerates, or consumers become more and more conscious and more purpose driven in terms of their consumption. So that's a very interesting output. From a brand's perspective, I think for every brand, it's very important to note this, that the consumer behaviors are changing. But on the other angle, from mitigating the pandemic point, one of the challenges, like we mentioned, with the brands is overstocking, also with the manufacturers. So there are multiple ways in let's say a decade back, if brands had overstocking problem, which they've had actually all along, this is the first time it's so large, they would have actually looked at landfills and oceans as like the easier solution to this. But considering almost all of the brand partners, especially like I think the Western bigger brands have such large circularity commitments, they cannot necessarily go into let this material go into landfills or oceans, which is why what do they do with this overstocking? So circular business models like reuse, models like resale, rework, even renting become very, very essential in mitigating not all of this issue, but some part of it. There are multiple such innovations which could be around recycling some of it, around moving some of the stock to next seasons, and then moving some of it to resale or reuse or circular business models. So I think it'll be essential in actually mitigating this in the shorter as well as longer term. In the longer term, we assume that they will be so used to this model that they would have derived this extra revenue that they would want to continue with this model.
Wonderful, and I'm so glad that the apparel industry is looking at this, because we've just heard reports of some electric bikes being completely just trashed because a particular company didn't know what to do about it, right? I mean, and it's wonderful to see that at least in the textile industry, we're starting to say that's not the obvious solution. Now let's look at reuse and rework and other circular business models. Nohar, can we bring you in here you work with reuse models. That's essentially what you do. What are you seeing, in terms of the shift in consumer patterns, both with your existing customers as well as potentially new customers? What are you expecting? So
there is a shift happening. I mean, obviously there are two kinds of shifts, and one's from a brand perspective, which Priyanka has covered. If you look at it from a consumer perspective, I mean, you got to go down a little bit of history and statistics. Economic slowdowns have always been great from a re-commerce point of view. It's just that people have, because of various reasons, and one of them is obviously because of less money in their pockets, they have gone into re-commerce. So you actually create a new breed of people who come into re-commerce. So that's the first thing you got to recognize over here. The other thing which data has always shown up is that you have a situation where people don't change the caliber of brands that they use. So if somebody's using brand X, they're not going to downgrade themselves to a lower brand. They'll just buy one or two instead of three or four. So that's again where e-commerce helps, because you get that same brand that much lower in price. You can buy the brand at obviously the brand of choice that you want, but from a e-commerce perspective, so the affordability kicks in. Now, when you look at e-commerce and reuse, it's generally about value. That's the first thing. Of course, there are other aspects of environment and sustainability and circularity, which we all want to talk about, and there's a certain percentage of people who actually believe in reuse for all these reasons. And then there's the aspect of uniqueness as well. If you again go into the old traditional concept of thrifting, it's always been about getting something unique which somebody else is not going to get. So that's what you got to keep in mind at this stage when you're looking at the consumer shift to reuse. If all these boxes are being ticked, the reuse model is going to get stronger and stronger, and the consumer is going to be shifting there. And we've already seen a little bit of that happening at our end as a business. We've got a lot of new customers who actually come in, who probably may not have come in if they were not in this COVID frame of mind. I think a lot of it is because of sustainability, but a bit of it is also because of value that is being created for them when they're getting into anything that is through e-commerce.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that. It's all about value, and like you said, I like what you said. Economic slowdown is generally good for e-commerce. And with that, we're going to take a quick break to run another poll. I think the WRI team is ready with that. When that poll disappears off the screen, we'll resume the panel. All right. Okay. So we've been talking about the consumers and the shift in buying patterns. Let's shift our attention back to the brands here for a minute. What we've seen or what we're expecting is that a lot of non-essential spending has been frozen or is being reevaluated for the brands, right? And the immediate focus is, of course, on dealing with the urgent business and operational challenges. But what are we going to see, in terms of fallouts of this crisis? How are they going to affect brand commitments towards the shift to circularity? Are certain things going to take a back seat? Are certain areas going to become more of a focus? Can I invite Ekta first to, take a shot at this one?
Pavitra, I mean, if I talk from a general perspective, then yes, definitely. Like we've been talking throughout this panel discussion that, sustainability, reuse models, whenever there's Nohar just mentioned about the economic slowdown, which we are already seeing, and it has affected everyone, not just one individual. It is at individual level, plus that's again the whole industry and industries, not just one industry. So in those times, definitely circular economies and sustainability becomes a key talking point. If I see from what we are doing at Wellspun, I would say that this has been one of the key drivers for Wellspun for some time, and this is going to only become stronger for us now. Spun is one of those kind of initiative where we use almost 2 tons of our textile waste to generate, to create beautiful home textiles products using the waste itself, whether those be cushion covers, rugs and cushions and things like that. And it is going to be important for the consumer as well, and for companies, and especially in textile industry, it's very important because water is a very important resource. It's a natural resource, and the kind of water consumption we have in textile industry is huge. I mean, it's about 100 liters of water we kind of use probably to digest, or process just 1 kg of textiles. So if you think about it, it's a huge impact, and hence looking again, I refer to technology. We have newer technologies like where you can have waterless dyeing. Even in denim industry, it's a new innovations have come up. People are looking at how they can reduce the consumption of water. At Wellspun, we have a totally, a water story by itself, where 100% of the water that we use is coming from the recycled water or the rain harvest. 60% of the water that is used for textile processing is coming from recycled water. So I think for companies, it is important to see and evaluate these kind of strategies, which involve using of natural resources and building up circular economies in a better way.
Wonderful. So we hope to see commitments being strengthened in companies like Wellspun, as we plot our recovery out of the crisis. Priyanka, did we lose Priyanka?
Yeah, I think she seems to have dropped off.
Okay. Okay, maybe we can just very quickly, move to another question, because I had something to ask Priyanka about the innovators aspect of it, right? Because they have a lot of their brands and manufacturers working with innovators. Okay, so we'll wait for Priyanka to log back online. Meanwhile, let's talk about supply chains, right? We've heard about the supply chain shocks. Actually, every other article is about the supply chain shocks, right, from COVID in pretty much every industry. The question now is, how do we look at, how is industry looking at making supply chains more resilient against future shocks? And again, here we'd like to discuss the traditional apparel supply chain as well as the reuse supply chain. So maybe Nohar, we can hear from you first about, your supply chain is obviously very different from the traditional model, but what are you seeing? Like, do you think it's more resilient? How can you plan for it to be more resilient against shocks like these?
So again, we're seeing the supply chain, moving in the right direction, because as what I mentioned a little earlier, e-commerce tends to do this. And also what's happened is in a lockdown phase, people are actually sitting at home and they actually realize that they have so much in their wardrobe which they're not using. So a lot of our supply chain as a company comes from your and my wardrobe, because our stats have shown that about 60-70% of what's in our wardrobe is not used anyway. At this moment, it's probably 90% plus which is not being used. So people are realizing the value of actually giving away product that they don't really need, because they understand the circularity aspect of it, and a lot of other aspects are also kicking in now, sustainability and all of that. So from a reuse point of view, the supply chain is increasing at this moment, and I think it will increase because a lot of these things will stick with people. Again, human beings have short memories, so once life goes back completely to normal, we might just forget about everything that happened in COVID. But I think the smart thing is that you live with those learnings, because if you're not going to live with them, then we're not going to make any progress. So I think there will be a subtle element of progress which will happen. It may not happen across the board 100%, but it will eventually happen. And once that happens, then you will find that consumption patterns and thinking processes change completely in the right direction, which we are looking at it changing. So I would really look at it from a reuse point of view. Of course, a lot of things will change also with technology. People are embracing technology a lot more today in various ways of life. And that'll happen with businesses as well. And supply chain, whether it happens on the reuse side or more so, when you're talking of new supply chain, a lot of it is related to technology in some form. And, you have certain virtual things that start happening. You have certain AI starts kicking in. So the efficiency levels will need to improve. And I think that's what will happen in the long term. It won't happen overnight. These things will take a couple of years to build, but eventually it will happen a couple of years from now.
Fantastic. And Priyanka, do you want to share your thoughts on how we make supply chains more robust, specifically with the brands you've been working with? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I'm so sorry. I seem to have gotten kicked out. Maybe my internet connection is not so good. Pavitra, sorry, could you repeat the question once again?
So we were talking about how one of the priority areas being making supply chains more robust and resilient against future shocks. So can we have your thoughts on how brands are looking at this now? Just before you pop back in, Nohar shared his perspective on the reuse side of things, but we're looking at a more traditional supply chains now.
Sure. Okay, so from our point of view, we haven't seen a lot of changes in the brand's, let's say, commitments in the last couple of months. In fact, what we've noticed is certain areas are popping up as really key areas of innovation, which will help make the supply chains more resilient, not even just in shorter term to mitigate this crisis, but also in the longer term. And we've done a lot of work in the past couple of months in identifying these areas. Some of these areas, which I'm happy to explain now, are supply chain transformation, stock management, of course, with the overstock issues, and then digital acceleration, particularly because there's hardly any movement that's been happening at this point of time. And while all of these, when we look at just overall supply chain and we talk about sustainability, we look at a lot of these areas, and across the supply chain, lots of innovation areas that the brands have already been focusing on, and I think that focus will continue. But these three sort of have popped out as immediate need for acceleration in the recent weeks. So when I talk about supply chain transformation, we've looked at a lot of brands, or this industry, I want to say, has been struggling with a lot of outdated sourcing models. There have been super heavy lead times. There's a lot of inflexibility currently in the industry. And there are a lot of innovation that can happen to transform this industry to making it slightly more demand-driven and also create more sustainability, environmental and social. And if we build those now, it will create resilience for a much longer term. And also, if there are future issues like COVID happening, we can potentially mitigate or have a lesser impact on the industry. And similar to this, we look at when I talk about supply chain transformation, whether it's on-demand production, which is demand-driven, making it more demand-driven supply chain, to nearshoring. There's been a lot of talk about innovation around this in the past, and we're hearing a lot more now. And of course, something that's most important now is probably safe workspace. So how do we make sure that the workplace now is safer for the workers there, particularly with the current infection issues? We're seeing lots of innovations being incorporated in the supply chain to actually get to assure that the virus spread is not happening now that the factories are opening. So that's on the supply chain transformation side. Then we can talk a little bit more about stock management. I've already covered a lot of this in the circular business models question that you asked earlier, which was really like all of these overstock issues. Innovations like circular business models become so important. Innovations like recycling, whether it's downcycling to other products or it's recycling into actually virgin grade materials of this overstocking material. I think that becomes very, very essential now. And then last, and probably something that has been on the offing for a while, is digital transformation or digital acceleration, as we call it. There has been so much in the industry or in the supply chain, which has been models that have just existed, like physical sampling. But if you actually look at it, the physical sampling is such a long and wasteful and redundant method because it requires transportation, it requires multiple materials going to and fro, it requires people traveling here and there. And just to be able to optimize a small aspect can have a massive impact on the supply chain. But also in challenges like this, it becomes a very useful solution. So we're seeing models like 3D design as well as digital sampling, of course, getting more and more mature with this pandemic. But because of this, we're also seeing newer areas pop up, like whether it's virtual showroom, whether it's virtual fashion shows, and other tools that enhance selling, but digital tools. So we're seeing a lot of that come through. So all of these tools together, I feel, create or build more resilience in the supply chain. And the sooner they're adopted, the better it is for the supply chain.
Wonderful. And Ekta, would you like to add on to that? From WellSpun standpoint, do you agree? Do you have some thoughts to add on here?
I think Priyanka has already said it all. Like, supply chains, in terms of they have to become more agile and adaptive. And yes, now we have to adapt to those kind of digital changes. Very rightly said, virtual sampling and fashion shows and things like that, where we spend a huge amount of money. I mean, the cost of sampling is huge. It's on supply chain, if you see, and actually where nowadays, and not just from this pandemic, before also, you could see all your consumers, are always asking for a better cost. So this could be, these kind of innovations could be a great way on bringing that benefit back to the consumer as well. So I think it's, I would just like to add on to what Priyanka said. She's already, said it more. So yeah, innovation in terms of digitization, there is artificial intelligence, virtual reality, all those things which probably supply chain would have never imagined, and they would say, oh, this is not for textile industry, is all something what companies are looking at very aggressively now to kind of, run their businesses. And it's going to stay for long. It's not going to, once you adapt those things, it's only going to take this in something for the betterment and also help in reducing of costs, in my view.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I think we've discussed, how to make supply chains more resilient. We've talked about our brands going to stay sustainability. And since we want to leave some time for audience questions as well, maybe we can, sort of wrap up the panel discussion with some final thoughts from our panelists on, what are some of the other aspects that we need to keep in mind that are like particularly for the apparel and textile industry in India as we start thinking about rebuilding the industry and the economy, right? And I'd like our panelists to focus a little bit on the particular issues we have here, like the migrant crisis as well. So what can be done? And Nohar, do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, happy to tackle this one. I mean, if you're talking of the way forward or rebuilding the industry, I mean, I've talked of reuse and rental. I just want to touch upon, recycle and upcycle, and Priyanka mentioned it a little while ago. I think in India, we don't give enough importance to that. We've actually, in a sense, the world capital for it. The world gives it importance, but we in India at the government level don't give upcycling or recycling any importance, and it can lead to massive amounts of, utilization of labor the right way. Because at this moment you talked of migrant labor. I mean, one of the industries that's going to suffer the most is actually the textile industry, because we are very, very dependent on labor. And when you come into, the recycle and the upcycle industry, they're even more dependent than, the industry that's producing new products. So you've got to kind of figure that out. A lot of them are disappearing or have disappeared back to their hometowns. If they get the right kind of work in their hometowns, they're probably never going to come back. This is a lost opportunity for us. But you've got to feel for them also, because the reality of it is that workers in India, unfortunately, don't have the skills sets that, they should have been given during some form of training. They don't have worker rights. Honestly, worker rights are very, very basic over here, and it's as good as zero. I mean, we don't treat them the right way. So these are aspects which also we need to look at moving forward. And again, it comes down to what we were talking earlier about having the right learnings. A lot of also what happens in the way forward is going to depend on brands. Brands have to have this commitment themselves. As you rightly said, will they be doing more now or will they be doing less? I mean, the smart ones, the long-term thinking ones are going to be doing a lot more, because they're going to realize also what is important in the consumer's mindset. Some of them are forced to do it because consumers are demanding more of that. And unfortunately, that's how it's been with brands over the last 10, 15 years. A lot of these initiatives have been actually pushed upon them by consumers. Now it's time for them to actually give back a little bit and do them, because they start believing in them and consumers are demanding them. And at the same time, we talked again a little while ago about consumers having short memory and going back a couple of years later to exactly where they were 20 years ago. That's where brands need to come in and make sure that with their aggressive advertising, with their push, they're changing what consumers do and how they're going to actually consume in future. So there are a lot of aspects to it. I mean, we can talk more about it. There's a social side to it. Obviously, people want to be giving more. There's also about relocating certain factories into some rural areas where workers actually don't have to leave their families and come into a city. I mean, governments need to kick in as well. So there's got to be a very collective effort. I mean, it's easy to discuss, but not that easy to put through. And it could be a 5 or a 10-year plan which needs to come into place after things are, somewhat normalized. But there's a lot that can be done.
Yes, there's a lot that can be done, and hopefully we'll be, paying a lot of attention to that as we plan the recovery. Priyanka, do you have something to add here?
Sure. I think, Nohar, I agree with everything Nohar said. To summarize, I absolutely agree. Governments have to play a huge role, and commitments and regulations definitely plays a big role here. There's also the other angle, as Nohar mentioned, that consumer behavior and changing consumer pattern needs to be tracked also, and companies need to have newer value proposition for the customers. So those two, I guess, are very key points. But last, which I guess we have more of an authority to comment on, is on the innovation angle. I do believe all industry stakeholders need to continue their commitments to sustainability and innovation, because companies who are focusing on innovation and sustainability are historically also we've seen, and going forward also we see, that will be much better prepared to meet these challenges and definitely come out stronger on the other end. So innovation needs to be there to optimize the whole supply chain, to create more transparency in the supply chain, to use actually resources better, and not have the wasteful resource structure that we have. So I believe it's sort of an opportunity that the industry has been given. Yes, there's much more negative to it than it's positive, but if you look at the silver lining or the positive side of it, it's an opportunity to rebuild the way the supply chain is driven. And while we've been discussing this for a couple of years, this is just an opportunity to do it as soon as possible rather than having longer term goals. So yeah, I think that would be my parting thought.
Thank you for sharing that. And Ekta, any final thoughts from you on way forward?
I think again, my point on upskilling would be a key thing in terms of when we are talking about rebuilding or being resilient for the future. I think when we are talking from in terms of laborers or migrants going away, and if they start finding jobs, I think what Nohar said earlier, that they have not been trained. So even for the local laborers, local workers, so why we need to engage with the migrant workers, because probably the local workers don't have the right skill, and we have certain pockets in certain states which come in and do certain jobs. So I think that's where the upskilling, the right training to the local people from within the nearby areas will play an important part, and hence where the government policies. I mean, government has been supporting companies, who are ready to take on initiatives where they are ready to train employees in different skills and all. I think that will be a key factor in resolving this or making this a better future. How are we prepared for better future will be a key thing. Yeah. I mean, at Welspun, if we think about it, we have seen 300% of upscale in the learning platforms that we have, so the current resources, how to optimize your current resources also is going to be a key factor.
That's wonderful to hear. And since we brought up the upskilling point many times, I'm not sure if one of our panelists knows about this. There was a news report a couple of days ago that said that the Uttar Pradesh government has started mapping the skills of the migrant workers that are coming back into the state, particularly from textile clusters in Gujarat and Maharashtra. I have to put this out there. I haven't been able to verify this with someone on ground, but this was the news report that they're starting to map the skills to see how then they can work with the workers to upskill them and look at employing them within the state, right? Because are they really going to go back to where they migrated back from? So interesting developments and fairly fast-paced developments at the moment. Thank you to the panelists for sharing some fairly diverse perspectives. I think our audience has been buzzing with questions. I'm going to take a moment here to just look through some of these questions and then read them out. And I invite any one of the panelists to take them, right? Okay. I think the first question is, okay, how do you see buying less, buying local, buying as sustainable as possible impacting the industry, and won't it hamper the industry growth if it catches on? Who wants to take this?
Well, I can attempt taking it.
Sure. No.
Buying less is likely to happen, as I said, because it tends to happen that way in a recessionary environment. Now, whether that changes 2-3 years down the line once things get back to normal is tough to say. Buying local, or as our Honorable Prime Minister said, be vocal for local, I really don't know what that means, because there's no definition on that. There are a lot of brands which manufacture locally, which are actually international brands. A lot of brands, there's certain product which they make locally, certain product internationally. So that's a tricky one. That's a very emotional one. So I don't know, it's an individual decision which people will have to make. But again, I don't think if you want to be a global economy, you can start coming down with things like that in the long term. In the short term, it's fine. Anyway, borders are closed. There's a lot of trade which is disrupted, etc. But in the long term, you have to open up again, and there'll be enough pressures at a government level by some of the really big international companies, not just in the textile or clothing space, but in other areas also, to get the balance right. So a lot of it really, it's hard to say now, but we'll have to wait and watch. But it was an interesting question.
Yeah, very, very interesting question. And in fact, I think a couple of the companies that I've spoken to where they offer, like regular apparel, but also apparel made from recycled fabric, these are sort of handled by different departments, and they're actually worried about, cannibalization of their own business. And these are questions that are just up there, and I think the answers are evolving, right? Ekta, Priyanka, do you guys want to add to that? Anything to share here?
Yeah, I'm like you said, it's evolving. I don't think we all have answers to this, but to just consider the whole localization and buying less in isolation, I don't think is good enough. When you look at the whole industry, if there is a small portion of that saying localization as well as let's say buying less, there are also multiple other efforts that are parallelly happening in the industry. So if you're talking about localization, we're also talking about on-demand manufacturing, or we are talking about localization of factory setup or part localization of factory setup. So you have to look at the impact with multiple changes together rather than just one of these changes. It's hard to say an industry will be impacted with just one change. We have to look at 5 or 6 things happening together for an overall impact. So I'm not sure this is the answer. It's just a thought process. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Priyanka. Ekta, would you like to add on?
So in terms of localization, I believe no industry runs by itself. It's always dependent on other industries as well. If you talk about textile industry, it's supported by a lot of other industries, whether you can talk about whether do you take machinery, for example, or farming, for example, from where your raw materials are coming. So it's very difficult to kind of say, when we talk about local, are we saying that are we 100% local? Because how are we going to curb everything, So when you're dependent on, and it's not just the textile industry, like Priyanka said, each industry is dependent on several other industries. So to kind of say that you are 100% local is kind of probably to a certain extent difficult. But like Nohar said, yes, in this pandemic time, it's probably easier to do that and say that because of the constraints we are all living in. But yeah, it's a challenge to have probably and see how we can support our own economies to the best possibility.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Moving on to the next question. I know as panelists, you've probably faced this a lot, but this has come up a lot, and which means it's still a concern for consumers. So I am going to bring this up. Bear with me. So there are various different claims. This is from Ravindra Sharma. There are various different claims on sustainability by brands. Can you think of a single standard to be adopted by brands which gives more clarity to the consumers? I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but I think it's a question that's still worth addressing because there's been no clear answer so far. Who wants to take this?
Maybe I'll give it a shot. I don't think I have an actual answer for this, but everything, like the whole industry, I believe, is in work in progress right now. And there are a lot of traceability standards that are coming through. There are certain certifications which are more valid globally, maybe not so much in India yet, but are starting to make their way into India. But yes, traceability has been highlighted as one of the key challenges in the industry. And even with mitigating the impacts of this pandemic, traceability innovations will be very, very prominent. And what traceability does is, or transparency and traceability does, is really help the consumers to know more about where the product comes from and what the overall impact is. So there are technologies right now that are prevalent wherein you can actually scan a barcode and tell the entire origin of a product, starting from farm level all the way till the final product. But yes, none of these are really at scale yet. And as with every change or every technology, there's a whole curve to adoption. And I would say this is starting to reach that space, and COVID-19 is actually pushing it into that space also of final adoption.
Brilliant. And okay, so this question is for Nohar specifically. It's about how, this is from Charmi, I hope I got the name right. how would Kiabza sanitize clothing before delivery to the end consumer, since it's a e-commerce platform? And maybe this is an opportunity, Nohar, to actually address some of the other concerns that consumers have as well, because I've seen some of the questions. Yeah.
So, I've been saying this, shouting from rooftops for the last 2 years, and that the clothing actually Kiabza has is actually cleaner and more hygienic than the new clothing you go and buy in the store near you. And I say that with reason, because I'm from that industry. So the reality of it is that when clothing comes to us, we actually dry clean it or wet wash it. It's checked under UV light, and everything is done without really any kind of contact eventually, and it's packed. So it's product which is absolutely fresh. When you're dealing with new clothing, okay, so the yarn is, or the cotton is grown somewhere, then the yarn is spun somewhere, then the fabric is woven or knitted somewhere, then it gets onto a table and it's cut somewhere, and then it's it's packed, and all the embellishments are put. Then it goes into a store. Probably 2 people have tried it before you, and then you buy it. And 90% of India, and I'm saying this statistically proven, buy something at 6 p.m. and wears it at 9 p.m. Because they're just buying it because they want to use it for date night, or they want to have an important office meeting the next day. So it's never been washed, but psychologically it's new. So they're kind of happy in that space that they bought a new product. So it's again about a mindset change, because the reality of it is the product has been touched by 10, 20, 30 human hands, and I dare say it, but some of the human hands have a bath maybe once a week, because they earn less than $100 in a month. So it's again the mindset, but Kiabza, we're very particular about what we're doing, and we've got obviously a COVID policy which is on our website that's being followed. We've just been allowed to open last week, so it's a little different. But I think from a sanitization point of view, pre-owned clothing generally, if it's been through a wet wash or a dry clean process, is actually more hygienic than new product, though it's not new.
Okay, perfect. I hope that addresses some of the concerns that some people here who might want to use the platform have been having. Okay, this is a question from Vishaka. What are businesses doing in the current times to slow down the movement of fashion? Can you give us examples of a few strategies that are being adopted? Slowing down the fashion industry, I think.
I think circular business model is a good thing to talk about here, because rental and resale is actually much more, is considered less of fast fashion and more of slow fashion, I would say. So that particularly would be a good point to talk about here, but also investments into probably newer raw materials, which might have slightly more higher cost impact, but have better and longer durability. I think businesses have been investing in those areas also. And then in technologies, and you link it back to circular business models, which means that companies or business can also work on reselling these again and again, because they are better quality materials, as well as, let's say, longer lasting materials, and then go into recycling. So in a twisted way, I think this would be the answer, that they're investing in new raw materials as well as investing in technologies which can keep these materials going on longer.
Okay, great. Do either Nohar or Ekta, do you want to add on to this, or do I move on to the next question?
Just to add very briefly on this, I think like we had spoken about changing consumer behaviors, I think change in that consumer behavior is already driving the companies, or you can say the brands, look into what Priyanka said, newer technology or finishes that can have the fabrics or the garments or textiles long lasting, and not also again antimicrobial finishes, antiviral finishes. Those are also some of the key factors which people say, okay, I don't want to then have it on every single garment. I mean, Nohar mentioned earlier that I think it's more the consumer behavior that will drive the companies or the brands to look into how to reduce fashion. Like he mentioned at the beginning of the panel, we have so many clothes when we are looking at our wardrobes. we all are wondering, what are we doing with so many clothes? So I think those kind of thought process will lead into consumer behavior changes, and that will lead into brands looking into how consumer is thinking now, which will lead into, it's like a chain reaction which will take its own place. So I think it's everybody's in the same boat in my view.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And coming to a very, very important and sort of the last question for today, how can slow fashion and the migrant worker issues how can they be internalized in a sustainable fashion model in post-COVID scenarios? I know this is a tough one, but clearly very, very important. So I'm going to ask each of you to spend maybe a moment. We just have a couple of minutes before we have to wrap up.
Would you repeat the question once again, please?
How can slow fashion and the migrant worker issues be internalized in building a sustainable fashion model in post-COVID scenario, in a post-COVID scenario?
I'm happy to start with this. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Priyanka.
So I feel like I'm definitely, or just Fashion for Good is not the best organization to talk about migrant crisis. I'm sure there are many more organizations that they're working much more closely with the workers and more suited to ask to, let's say, answer these questions. But from our point of view, from a just, let's say, an overall circularity, sustainability point of view, we also look at social innovation and innovations around social. So I think one aspect of internalizing, which we are seeing some of our partners actually working on right now, is working with companies who are creating support for workers. So, for example, innovations like, or companies like Anwider, which have been part of our platform before, who have been giving this anonymous support through mobile services to workers so that they can actually get back and give feedback to working conditions of their working conditions. And these now are getting more integrated with COVID support as well. So, for example, to be able to check on their health as well as to be able to check on the supplies that they need, all through these anonymous platforms. Similarly, there are many more companies that are emerging now, like Inspectorio Rights, also looking at the worker rights, as well as looking at now COVID support as an added layer to their existing product. And also there's a Bangladesh-based platform called Epon Wellbeing, another very good company to look at, which is looking at supplies to workers in crisis situations. So I would say companies are now looking to internalize these in a permanent basis so that they become an essential part of the supply chain and not just an added benefit to workers.
Wonderful. It's very encouraging to hear about some of these things. Ekta, did you want to share your?
So, Pavitra, like I kind of mentioned before, from we at Wellspan have already taken several measures, for our workers, where that be whether those be the sanitizing tunnels, ensuring that we have also worked with an application development for like a doctor's app on a robotics, where a worker can actually have a direct access at the workplace to the doctors if they have any health issues. It's not just related to COVID, but to any health issues. So I think those kind of measures we have provided, facilities for them to stay closer to the factories, bringing some of our supply chain raw material things closer to the factories. So I think these are not going back to what they were, anytime now. So this is now our new normal, and it's going to stay with us for us. So like Priyanka mentioned, that people are looking at it as an added benefit. It's not like an added benefit, it's like a necessity now. And this is how we can, and upskilling again, I keep mentioning upskilling. So we have provided opportunities to our workers in terms of whether they have full access to our educational and learning and training platforms, hygiene and safety, access to health doctors, sanitization. These are all the things that have become the new normal now, and we are not going back to what it was pre-COVID. So, yeah.
Wonderful. And thank you for sharing that. Just being a little conscious of time here, I think we're about a minute beyond 4:30. So, Nohar, sure. Can I give you like 30 seconds?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they've covered everything. I'll just say, there's been the concept of fair wages for a long time, which has actually not been honored by most companies internationally. You got to draw a balance between actually the commercial aspect of fair wages and actually exploitation. Governments have to be playing a role as well. So there's just so many factors, but as Ekta said, there's an awareness now which will kick in, and hopefully a lot of these things will change. I'll just address the first part of the question about slowing down fashion. That's all consumer driven, and the person who asked that question, I'm going to ask them a question: that are they going to be buying less when they go next time to stores? Because if they're going to be buying less, then you are slowing down fashion. But if they're not going to be doing it, it's not going to happen. So it really again comes out. The brands are not going to do it. H&M and Zara and all don't want to sell half of what they're selling. So it's got to be the consumers who got to slow it down. So we'll have to wait and watch. It's a question mark over there.
All right, thank you for that. And on that note, we will have to conclude this panel. Just to sort of summarize what we've talked about, it's very clear that things are very uncertain, and these are very sobering times with a lot for us to reflect on. But clearly, based on the discussion we've had today, it's also an opportunity to rethink how we've been doing things, and traceability, digital acceleration, mainstreaming and sort of internalizing on a permanent basis some of these issues, like some of these innovations around migrant worker rights and worker health and safety and hygiene practices, which are so far added benefits, right? We now have an opportunity to mainstream those at an accelerated pace, and I think that's what's important. And just going back to quote Nohar on what he said about economic crises are good for e-commerce. They're actually good for accelerating certain kinds of changes, which would have typically happened over a few years, but we can now hope to mainstream them within a few months. That's kind of been my takeaway from this panel. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing fairly diverse perspectives. And I'm going to hand it back to actually, also thank you to the audience for being super engaged. You've asked us a lot of questions, and we obviously don't have the time to address all of them, but we'll make sure that our panelists see them and at least reflect on them. I'm going to hand it back to Komal now to wrap up the proceedings.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Pavitra, for directing this insightful discussion. I think we all took some key takeaways from it. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone. We had some interesting conversations, amazing to hear different perspectives. I would like to thank all the speakers and panelists once again. And thank you to the attendees. It was you can follow us on social media channels to get in touch with us, and there will be a survey now. Please try to fill that at the end. And on that note, I would like to close the webinar. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone. Have a good day ahead. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.